You know, when you think about Roman strongmen, names like Caesar, Sulla, or Augustus probably pop into your head, right? But what about the man who ruled Rome for 3 straight years during one of its most chaotic periods ever? Today, we're diving into the story of Lucius Cornelius Cinna, a guy who's often just written off as a bloody tyrant. And to do that, we're turning to the work of Harold Bennett. In his incredible deep dive, Cinna and His Times, Bennett makes this really compelling case that maybe, just maybe, our entire view of Cinna is built on the propaganda of his enemies.
So to really get Cinna, you have to get the world that made him. And Rome in 88 BC was, well, it was an absolute pressure cooker. The Republic was cracking at the seams from civil wars, and especially the brutal social war, where Rome's own Italian allies fought tooth and nail just for the right to be called citizens. The whole system was breaking down. And into this chaos, 2 rivals would end up forging the future of Rome in blood and fire.
All right, so this whole chapter of Roman history kicks off with a solemn oath and a political deal that was pretty much destined to go horribly, horribly wrong. This is where Cinna rises to the highest office in the land, the consulship, but he does it in a city that's literally occupied by the armies of his political opponent, the fearsome general, Sulla.
Now, Sulla had just done the unthinkable. He marched his own legions on his own capital city. He shoved through a bunch of unpopular, aristocratic reforms, and the people were absolutely furious. But here's the thing. Sulla had a war in the east he had to get to. He couldn't just leave a city full of enemies at his back. He needed to throw them a bone, some kind of concession.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting, because this flips the common story completely on its head. Most history books will tell you that the people elected Cinna, a known enemy of Sulla, as a big act of defiance. But Harold Bennett argues the exact opposite. He says Sulla, in a really shrewd political move, actually backed his rival Cinna for consul. Why? To calm down the angry masses and create this illusion of stability before he skipped town.
To seal this very shaky truce, Sulla demanded a huge, public spectacle of an oath. Picture this, standing on the Capitoline Hill, the sacred heart of Rome. Cinna takes a stone in his hand. He swears to uphold all of Sulla's policies, and then he hurls the stone to the ground, asking the gods to cast him out just like that stone if he ever broke his word.
And yeah, you guessed it, Cinna broke that oath almost immediately. He brought back a super controversial law to give the new Italian citizens full voting rights by spreading them across all the voting districts. Now his enemies claimed he was bribed a mind-boggling 300 talents to do it. Whatever his real reason, this one act of betrayal just lit the fuse on a brand new civil war.
So, Cinna's big political gamble? It backfired. Spectacularly. His own co-consul drove him out of the city, and the Senate illegally stripped him of his office and citizenship. The guy who was just sworn in as consul? Yeah, now he's an outlaw. But he was far from done.
Cinna's comeback was just astonishingly fast. He presented himself as the true, wrongfully deposed consul, and he quickly won over an entire army. And then he made a fateful alliance with Gaius Marius, a living legend, but now a bitter, exiled old general who was just itching for revenge. Together, they marched right back to the city that had just kicked them out.
And look, this wasn't just some disorganized mob. They were smart. They organized their forces into 4 separate armies, each commanded by a capable leader, Cinna, Marius, and 2 others, Carbo and Sertorius. They completely surrounded Rome, aiming to starve the city into submission.
Meanwhile, Rome's defense was just collapsing from the inside. The city was overcrowded, it was unsanitary, and a devastating plague swept through the camps of the defending army. It claimed a staggering 17,000 lives from disease alone. Rome was basically doomed before the final battle was even fought.
Rome surrendered. Cinna and Marius walked back into the city, and what happened next has gone down in history as one of its absolute darkest chapters. But was it the mindless bloodbath that we've all been told it was?
The traditional story, which was shaped in large part by Sulla's own memoirs, paints this horrifying picture. It says Marius, driven insane with rage, just unleashed his forces on the city for 5 straight days of indiscriminate killing, settling old scores, and butchering his political enemies left and right.
But Bennett's research really forces us to pump the brakes and ask, was this just random terror, or was there actually a grim, cold logic at play here?
And this is where Bennett's analysis just completely flips the script. He argues the evidence doesn't point to a random massacre, but to a calculated political purge. It seems there was a council of death, which included Cinna and other leaders, that basically drew up a hit list of specific, high-level political enemies. And when the violence did spiral out of control, with liberated slaves seeking their own revenge, it was actually Cinna and another commander, Sertorius, who stepped in, surrounded the perpetrators, and put a stop to the chaos. It was brutal, for sure, but it wasn't mindless.
So, after the purge, Cinna's new regime faced an even bigger challenge. How do you govern a state that's on the brink of total economic collapse? And honestly, this is where the story gets truly surprising.
With the treasury totally empty and citizens just crushed by debt, the government passed a seriously radical law, the Lex Valeria de Aere Eliano Solvendo. It was, in essence, a massive state-sponsored debt relief program.
So just how radical are we talking? Well, this chart says it all. The Lex Valeria allowed Roman citizens to completely wipe out their debts by paying only 1/4, just 25% of what they originally owed. This was an extreme measure for an extreme crisis, and it was designed to stop a total meltdown of the Roman economy.
But they didn't stop there. To fight runaway inflation and this total loss of faith in the currency, they launched what Bennett calls a wise and salutary reform, led by a guy named Marius Gratidianus. They recalled all the counterfeit and plated silver coins that were flooding the economy, and then they guaranteed the value of the new official silver coins. You see, according to Bennett, these aren't the actions of simple tyrants. They're the pragmatic moves of a government desperately trying to pull Rome back from the abyss.
So how are we supposed to remember a guy who seized power through bloodshed, but then passed laws to save the entire economy? This really brings us to the core conflict of Cinna's whole legacy. And here Harold Bennett reminds us of a timeless lesson. History is almost always written by the winners. As he points out, so much of what we think we know about Cinna comes from sources who were deeply hostile to him, especially Sulla, the man who would eventually come back and destroy Cinna's regime. We have to, as Bennett says, account for that party prejudice of the original writers.
Which leaves us with two completely different portraits of the same man. Was he a bloody tyrant who trampled the Constitution and murdered his rivals? Or was he a pragmatic statesman who did what was necessary to stabilize a broken republic, fix long-standing problems, and rescue a collapsing economy? The truth, as it so often is probably somewhere in that really uncomfortable space between the two.
And that leaves us with a final question that echoes way, way beyond ancient Rome. In a moment of absolute crisis, when all the old rules don't seem to apply anymore, where do you draw the line between a leader doing what's necessary and a tyrant just seizing power for themselves? Cinna's forgotten story forces every single one of us to confront that very question.